As the professor had just said, I had worked for the UN beginning in 1992 in Cambodia, and then I had stayed on with the UN to work in the former Yugoslavia in 1994, during the war there, and then afterwards in 1996. And Mr. Akashi was the head of the UN operation, as I think everyone here knows, both in Cambodia in 1992-93, and then also in the former Yugoslavia. I was a very junior official in 1992. Mr. Akashi was the boss of my boss, and so I saw him only occasionally. I was very much in the outer circle at that time. But in the former Yugoslavia, in Zagreb, where I worked, and in Sarajevo, I was a spokesman for the UN, and I saw Mr. Akashi a lot then, and we, a group of young UN officials, worked very closely with Mr. Akashi and learned a lot from him. And for me, those years, 1992 to 1996, were a very formative time in trying to understand better both the potential and also the limits of multilateral action. And in the last 20 years, not just the UN's experience in different internal conflicts, but the very difficult experiences the international community has had in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere, I think has taught us a lot and has influenced much of my thinking also in terms of what is possible in Myanmar and how the outside world might be able to help. In the time I have, I would like to focus very much on the situation in Myanmar, looking forward but also looking back to Myanmar history. And in starting with Myanmar, I think as everyone here knows, this is a time of reform. We are living in Myanmar in an age of reform. And over the past 4 years, we've seen rising expectations, and we've seen political changes taking place. A new constitution has been put forward. The government has significantly liberalized the political environment. We've seen important economic reforms and the beginning of a peace process. And for many who saw Myanmar, I think in the old days, as a black hole where very little changed and very little change was possible, the reforms of the past few years have seemed dramatic, almost miraculous. But 5 years on, or 4.5, 5 years on, these expectations have increasingly been tempered by concern and worry. And there are new stories of violence, especially violence between Muslim and Buddhist communities, of a peace process that has stalled at times, question marks about whether or not Myanmar is indeed on the path to long-term democracy. In these months, you will see a focus on the elections, which will take place on the 8th of November, and perhaps on the peace process, where we hope to sign the first national ceasefire agreement on the 2nd or 3rd of October, so just in a couple of weeks' time. But I think if we took only this narrow focus around the politics of today, the elections, the peace process, it'll be very hard to get any kind of real idea of what is happening in Myanmar and where Myanmar might be going. And as a historian, I would argue for taking a much broader focus and understanding a little bit the moment that we're in relation to the broad history of the country. I'd like to start with 1885 and what I think is the most important date in the modern history of Myanmar, which was the 28th of November, 1885, which was the day that the British entered our old capital of Mandalay and took the king and exiled him to India. And over the coming few weeks and months, abolished the monarchy which had ruled the country for over 1,000 years, destroyed all the royal institutions that had grown up in Myanmar over many centuries. Over the year that followed, oversaw the collapse of the aristocracy which had dominated the countryside, and began a major process of radical social and economic change in Myanmar that abruptly broke all the traditions that had existed up until that point and created a lot of the modern Myanmar that we have today. The British ruled what was then the Kingdom of Myanmar for actually a very short time, from 1885 until the 1940s. But the legacies of that period are still very strong. And I think unless we understand the legacies of that time and what happened during that time, again, it's more difficult to understand what is going on now and what the options may be. Again, the British rule in Myanmar, or Burma at the time, in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, was a radical break with old tradition. One of the most important aspects of British rule in Myanmar was that Myanmar, or again Burma at the time, became a province of India, of British India and the British Indian Empire, and it was treated no differently than other provinces of India. Burma was a relatively rich part of the British Indian Empire and a relatively rich place in the region as a whole, and this then led to massive migration of people, of several 100,000 people from China to Burma at the time, and millions of people from India, so that by the 1920s, Rangoon, the capital at the time, became one of the largest immigrant ports anywhere in the world, and at its peak, more than 2 million people from India, or the rest of India, were migrating to Myanmar. This was at a time when the population of the country was only 12 to 13 million people. Myanmar grew economically very fast. Its development was a very rapid one. Many industries like oil and teak, precious stones, rice in particular, grew tremendously during these years. But the Burmese people saw themselves or believed themselves to be unfairly treated at that time. And what they saw was the emergence of a new modern economy in which the ordinary Burmese person was at the bottom of the pyramid, where a few Europeans were at the top, and then people from China and India, foreign companies, and then the great mass of Burmese people at the bottom. This was the perception. And modern politics in Burma emerged in the 19-teens and 1920s as an anti-colonial movement, but an anti-colonial movement that was very focused on anti-immigration and a deep hostility to what we would today call global capitalism, to foreign companies coming in and what they saw as exploiting the economy. And that emergence of modern Burmese politics, from this sense that Burma was in danger of losing its identity, was under foreign occupation, in danger of losing its culture, was, as it opened up, being exploited from the outside by foreign companies, by people coming in. This is something that has a deep resonance in Burmese political culture, I would argue even to this day. And so much of Burmese political thinking, political literature, stems back from that period in the 19-teens and 1920s. The first boycotts, the first demonstrations, all happened in that environment. And of course, in the 1930s, with everything happening in the world, many young Burmese became increasingly attracted to communism, to fascism. And in the 1940s, we had the Second World War, the invasion of Japan, and then after the Japanese occupation, British rule lasted only for 3 years. So if you think about it, British rule in Myanmar was very, very short. Some parts of the country had been annexed before, but most of the country was under British rule only from 1885 to the late 1940s. So within the lifetime of a person. And one of our great anti-colonial thinkers and writers, the King Goramine, for example, he was still alive in the 1940s and lived until independence, but as a young man, he remembers watching the king being taken away at Mandalay. So unlike many other parts of the British Empire, which lasted long, in Burma what had happened was that the British had come in and destroyed the old traditional order, but then did not or were not able to stay long enough so that new British institutions, the civil service, the judiciary, the parliament, emerged from colonial rule in a very weak state. And this combined with the second colonial legacy, which was that the British ruled Burma in two different ways. The mountainous areas, especially in the north and the east, were ruled indirectly through local chiefs. These were areas inhabited by ethnic minority peoples who spoke different languages. Many of these people became Christian during British rule. And then the center of the country, which was ruled directly, and where modern politics was born. And these were areas of Burmese, of the ethnic Burmese people, who then were the ones who began this modern and very quite radical nationalist tradition by the 1920s and 1930s. And this whole mix of things, the weak colonial institutions, the severe economic damage from the war, this colonial legacy of people being treated differently and seeing themselves very differently, of different ethnicities who distrusted each other in the 1940s, all of this then led to the collapse of the state in Burma, quite soon after the British withdrawal. The British gave independence to Burma in January of 1948. By January of 1949, the country was at civil war. By February of 1949, what was left of the Burma army, of one battalion, controlled only Yangon, or Rangoon at the time, and barely the area up to the airport. And if you think about Myanmar history between then and now, you can think about it in many ways, but one way is it's the history of the Burma army going from that position where they controlled only the city of Rangoon to the situation now where they are by far the most dominant institution everywhere in the country. And for them, for the military, they see themselves as the legitimate power in Myanmar, not because of elections, but because they feel that they are the institution that held the country together against communists and against other rebel groups for over 50, 60, 70 years. So because of the collapse of institutions, the weak institutions, democracy was a very frail thing. The army became ever stronger because it was fighting all of these different insurgents, including insurgents, the communists and others who were supported from China at the time, so that by the 1960s, the army felt that they didn't need democracy at all, that they could do away with civilian government, that they could do away with political parties and politicians and take power directly. And of course, this was not something strange. Pakistan was a military dictatorship, Thailand was a military dictatorship, Taiwan was a military dictatorship. There were many military dictatorships everywhere in Asia. But what was different about Myanmar was the extent to which it chose to isolate itself completely from the outside world, ending foreign aid, ending any sort of contact with outside businesses. Tourism was banned, scholarships were banned. And so the extent to which it isolated itself completely stemmed in large part from that experience of the early 20th century. The army's position or policies in the 1960s of isolating its country were extreme, but in a way it was only an extreme end of this nationalist spectrum that had existed in Myanmar and had grown up over 50 years. The other way in which it was different was that many military dictatorships, if you take Park Chung-hee's dictatorship in Korea, gave Korea rapid economic progress, whereas in Myanmar, 30, 40 years of military rule only led to rapid economic decline. And by the 1980s, the military rule in Myanmar had left Myanmar as one of the poorest countries in the region. In 1962, when the military took over, its per capita GDP was almost the same as South Korea. By the 1980s, it was a fraction of South Korea, and it was already one of the poorest countries in Southeast Asia. So by then, everyone wanted change. Some people had wanted an immediate overthrow of the military government, so we saw the uprising in 1988. The old communist movement had collapsed, and so people rallied around this idea of democracy, of a return to democratic government as the answer for all the failings of military rule. And I would think that now, if we jump to the situation today, and we see all of these different issues, democracy, development, the ending of the armed conflict after 70 years, these are all very important things. But I would argue that actually the most important thing happening in Myanmar today, and the biggest challenge facing Myanmar, is its de-isolation and its rejoining the world community after 50, 60 years of being apart. This is the most difficult thing. We've seen in other parts of Asia transitions to more democratic government, like in Indonesia. We've seen in the rest of Asia very poor countries move quickly to develop, like in Vietnam, not too far away. We've seen in other countries armed conflicts dissipate and formerly war-torn countries become peaceful. We've never seen all three of these things happen together at the same time, and at the same time that a country that has been isolated for so long having to rejoin the world. And I think this is the thing that people cannot underestimate in Myanmar, is how deep the effect of this isolation has been. And oftentimes it's not an effect on poor people, it's an effect at the elite level. If you look at the elite institutions in Myanmar, the top people, the top institutions, there you see the scars of isolation in the education system, in the universities, in the civil service, where there is nothing like the capacity that is necessary for Myanmar to successfully rejoin the international system and the international economy. And think of it this way. Myanmar is now trying to rejoin the rest of the world, trying to do this mixed set of transitions, political, economic, the peace transition, when it is the poorest and weakest country in the region. And so it's almost bound, as it opens its doors, to feel again that it's being exploited. Even the best companies coming in, even with the best intentions from the outside, there is going to be a feeling of nationalism, because that feeling of nationalism is so deep in Myanmar. And we already see conservative rhetoric. We already see people anxious and uncertain about what their place is going to be and what the future of Burmese culture and the main religion, Buddhism, is going to be in this new world as the country opens up. So to be able to successfully open up and not suffer from a nationalist backlash, I think is the big challenge going ahead in Myanmar. We've seen in the last 5 years a lot of progress. No one can deny that. I think moving away from a pure military dictatorship to something that is not a democracy, but at least is a step towards civilian and more open government, is one of the most difficult things possible. And one looks at dictatorships, say, in some parts of Africa. You have the same person in power for dozens of years, unwilling to give up power until to their deathbed. And in Myanmar, at least, we've had this initial shift, this initial move. The question is how to build from that. So I think we cannot underestimate how difficult and how important this initial set of shifts can be. And I think in the very long term, Myanmar has a very bright future because of its place in Asia. We have a young workforce. We have young people who are extremely eager to catch up with the rest of the region. And I think across Myanmar, you talk to anyone, and the greatest desire is for Myanmar to catch up to China, India, Thailand, all the other countries in the region. That's very strong. But we cannot underestimate the challenges that are there. And again, going back to what I said at the beginning, we have the history of failed state building. The old royal institutions removed, the British institutions collapsed, the military's attempts at state building not leading to any kind of modernization or economic progress. So we have state institutions that are not just weak, but also unable or have not demonstrated the capacity necessary to face contemporary challenges. We have the lack of an inclusive identity, again going back to the colonial legacies, where you have a single nationalist tradition based around the ethnic Burman or Burmese Buddhist peoples, but there is no national identity that includes all the people who live within Myanmar. And in a way, even more important than the peace negotiations and the ceasefire negotiations is this need for an inclusive identity that can bring all of the people together. Because otherwise, if you have a fractured society where people see themselves as very different, and then you have 1 billion plus people in China, 1 billion plus people in India on the other side, there will always be this sense, this anxiety of a country that is going to be overwhelmed. We have this legacy also, or this enormous challenge related to the education system. And there's a social history behind this. In 1962, the army took over. In 1964, English was banned in the education system, teaching English-based education. Private schools, which were amongst the best in Asia, were nationalized. The last generation of well-educated Burmese were the Burmese who graduated from high school maybe in 1970. And so if you graduated from high school in 1970, you're just about past retirement age now. After that generation, the capacity in Myanmar falls off a cliff. In the 1970s, 80s, early 90s, universities were closed many years. Education system was dismal. And so we are moving into this transition and these challenges with this huge gap of people between the ages of, say, 35 and 65 lacking. And that middle management, senior management, lack of trained, educated, skilled people is again another challenge that we cannot underappreciate. Now, In all of this, I think there is a tremendous role for the international community. By international community, I mean countries and peoples outside. But so far, I don't think that that international role has been maximized. The involvement of the international community so far has been an important one. So for instance, sanctions were lifted, or almost all sanctions were lifted by the West quite early on. Debt was restructured or written off. Many people, many governments encouraged their businesses to look to invest, and investment did come in, and aid programs have been increased significantly. But all of that is not enough given the scale of the challenges in Myanmar. And in a way, you know, what we need to think about is, again, Myanmar not as a country trying to move towards democracy and needing some aid and some investment, but as a country that has been torn apart by 70 years of civil war and is emerging from this deep isolation. It requires a different level of support and assistance from the outside, which hasn't been forthcoming. If we look at all of these different issues, democratization, peace, major economic development, all of these things are interlinked and need to be thought of together from an international perspective. By one estimate, Myanmar will need about $100 billion in infrastructure investment between now and 2030, in the next 15 years. Much of that capital will need to come from internal sources, but a lot of that, maybe $20, $30 billion, will need to come internationally. Myanmar needs everything. It needs electricity, it needs roads, it needs railways, it needs all kinds of basic hard infrastructure, but it also needs soft infrastructure in terms of healthcare, better education, and all of these things. Now, where will that money come from? I don't think that if you look at the whole puzzle, the need to move ahead maybe in an evolutionary way, but in a steady way towards democracy, the need to move ahead on this peace process, which involves over 20 different armies and armed groups, the need to move ahead on economic development and attract billions of dollars in investment, you know, to pull all of this together requires a capacity that is going to have to be both national and international at the same time. The national capacities alone must be in the driver's seat, and people, Myanmar people through democratic institutions, must be ultimately in charge. But the national capacity is not there, I would argue, to pull all of this together on its own. And again, where will this money come from? As all of you know, we live in a zero interest rate world. There are hundreds of billions of dollars in the world, trillions of dollars, looking for a place to get more than 1 or 2% interest. Myanmar is a poor country that can develop very fast. Myanmar is not like an industrialized country where we'll be lucky to get 2, 3% growth. Myanmar is a country if it had that infrastructure investment, can take off the way China, Vietnam, other countries have taken off in the region and grow 10, 15%. Myanmar is a country where investors could receive 15, 20% returns. But how do you connect the hundreds of billions of dollars that are out there to the infrastructure needs and development needs in Myanmar in a way that will also strengthen moves towards democracy and strengthen moves towards peace? I think this is the big question. This is the central question. And it's a question for which the United Nations, external aid agencies are not prepared. Because Myanmar is not the traditional post-conflict country, a small, war-torn post-conflict country where you need some aid, maybe $500 million, $1 billion worth of aid, and you put together a peace deal. Myanmar is a country which has all of those problems and more, but because it's next to China, because it's next to Thailand, because it's next to Singapore, it has a tremendous potential to grow very, very fast. And it's very rare to see that situation of a country where the capacity is so low and the challenges are so great, but then the potential of rapid economic transformation is so high, and we don't have the institutions in the UN and the World Bank and national bureaucracies to know how to think about those connections. And so if you think about, let me just give you a concrete example. If you think about the southeast of Myanmar, many of you may have been to Thailand. This is the area just to the west of Bangkok along the border near Chiang Mai. This is an area in which several million people live in Myanmar. This is an area where there's been a lot of fighting. and where there is now a ceasefire and the possibility of a stable ceasefire and moves towards peace. There are 500,000 refugees and IDPs who need to come home or need to leave their current places. There are a dozen different aid organizations that are looking at different development projects. At the same time, the Thai government, in consultation with the Japanese government and ADB, are looking, the Asian Development Bank, are looking at a multi-billion-dollar deep sea port and industrial complex in that area. The Myanmar government is looking at new industrial zones in that area. The ADB is looking to build a highway between Bangkok and Yangon. But no one is combining all of these things together. If you look at this area, it's a war-torn area. 20 kilometers on the other side, you have Thailand with 15 million tourists a year. This is an area where tourists can grow to 2 million, 3 million, 5 million within 5 to 10 years. But no one is connecting the big economic potential with the democratic transition issues, with the peace processes. And of course, in all of this, China looms very large, because we can say international community, but not everyone is equal. And for Myanmar, one of the most important issues going forward will be how to manage relations with China. And China, of course, has had an outsized influence on Myanmar history for more than 1,000 years. There has never been a big change in China that has not had a big impact in Myanmar, from the Mongol invasions to the Ming dynasty to the Manchu conquest to the communist revolution. And what happens next in China under Xi Jinping is going to have a huge impact on what happens next in Myanmar. But it has a special importance because that borderland between China and Myanmar is controlled not by either government, but by different militia and armed groups. China is the one country that can support the peace process or undermine the peace process. China holds the key to Myanmar's short-term future. Any international effort has to include China in some way. And so this is the big opportunity, but it's also a big problem. How does Japan, China, the United States, the UN, the World Bank, other big players come together? Myanmar is, because of its location, because of changing post-Cold War politics, is in a strategic location. Everyone can look at the map now and see it between India, China, ASEAN. For strategic reasons, people are increasingly interested in Myanmar. For Myanmar, it can benefit from competition between China, Japan, India, the US, and others. But it will benefit more from cooperation between everyone. And so this is the question. How can we begin a process of international cooperation in Myanmar that is going to go beyond the normal things that institutions like the UN do, that is going to bring about this economic transformation, this $100 billion economic transformation over 15 years, but in a way that will also promote democracy and peace in the country. I think for Japan, Myanmar is a great challenge and opportunity. It's as was said, Myanmar and Japan have a long history together. The first Japanese who came to Myanmar were in 1623, who were samurai who came to be the bodyguard of a king in Myanmar, and it goes on from there. And Japan, there's a great curiosity about Japan in Myanmar, and I think people are looking to Japanese businesses, Japanese government, people-to-people relations in a positive way. But how Japan then plays this opportunity, uses this opportunity, seeks to work or not work with other countries, is going to be, I think, a really important test going forward. And lastly, for the people of Fukuoka, I think what I would say is that because of what I had said about the importance of de-isolation, I think the more that people visit the country, especially people who are genuinely interested in Myanmar, can visit the country as tourists, can help to promote people-to-people relations, the more contacts there are between universities and NGOs, the better. And the more that people, ordinary citizens like yourselves, can also encourage the government to make this transformation in Myanmar a priority, I think it's something that will be of great benefit to people in Myanmar. And I'm sure, whatever happens, that relations between Fukuoka and Myanmar and Japan and Myanmar will only be strengthened in the years to come. Thank you very much.